war as an effort to materially change the balance of power. It was done in secret. Steps were taken really to deceive us by every means they could. And they were planning in November to open to the world the fact that they had these missiles so close to the United States.
In October of 1962, the world's most powerful countries, Russia and the United States, stood on the brink of nuclear war. Russia's attempt to provide Fidel Castro, the communist leader of Cuba, with nuclear weapon capabilities created one of the greatest diplomatic challenges mankind has ever faced. The 13 days between October 16th and October 28th, 1962, tested U.S. President John F. Kennedy and Russian President Nikita Khrushchev's commitment to diplomacy and open communication. Without diplomacy, millions of people faced the very real and tragic consequences of nuclear weapons being exchanged between the superpowers, a point in time that Kennedy once described as the abyss of destruction. Despite public posturing and military shows of force by both countries, in the end, a nuclear war was avoided through the power and diplomacy of personal letters Khrushchev and Kennedy exchanged.
Well, whatever act of diplomacy has ever occurred in American history, there was never an act of diplomacy that was so important to succeed. And if this act of diplomacy had not succeeded, we would not be here today to talk about it. So in a sense, there have been loads of examples in American history of wonderful acts of diplomacy, but never has so much been on the line than literally nuclear holocaust if this diplomacy hadn't been successful.
The relationship between the U.S. and Russia had been increasingly strained in the years leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The tension between the two nations following World War II was known as the Cold War. The Cold War was centered around the U.S. and Russia's building of their nuclear weapons, along with Russia's desire to spread communist rule. Since direct military conflict could quickly escalate to the use of nuclear weapons, the two countries chose to engage in a battle of words to establish their position as the most powerful country in the world. Following Hitler's fall, government control of war-torn Germany was divided among the United States, England, France, and Russia. The area under Russian control included the capital city of Berlin, which was also overseen by the four countries. East Germany and East Berlin, like many other Eastern European countries under Russia's influence, quickly adopted communist principles and beliefs. Other parts of the world discovered communist rule, including China, Southeast Asia, and Cuba, a tiny island 90 miles off the shore of Miami, Florida. With Spanish heritage and architecture, Cuba was a vacation destination for many Americans until the 1950s when the Cuban Revolution began. Led by a young Cuban lawyer named Fidel Castro and an Argentinian revolutionary named Che Guevara, the Cuban Revolution was a 6-year armed revolt intent to overthrow the U.S.-supported Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. The revolt was successful, with Castro taking control in 1959, transforming the island from a tourist getaway to a communist nation intent on protecting itself from imperialism. A Russian ally within missile range of the continental United States caused President John F. Kennedy and his administration much concern. This concern led the U.S. to publicly cut diplomatic ties with Cuba, while the Central Intelligence Agency covertly recruited and trained anti-Castro Cubans to attempt a military overthrow in 1961. The unsuccessful 3-day operation, called the Bay of Pigs for the beach where the invasion took place, resulted in the death of 1,400 U.S.-backed Cubans. The event was a personal embarrassment for the newly elected Kennedy administration, while strengthening Castro's relationship with the Russian leader Nikita Khrushchev. The U.S. failure also caused Russia to become more confident in its actions. Months later, in Vienna, Austria, Khrushchev aggressively challenged the young Kennedy, threatening to cut off East German access roads to West Berlin if control wasn't turned over to Russia. In the summer of 1962, the United States government began to believe Soviet missile launchers were being built in Cuba. For months, U.S. spy planes recorded suspicious activities on the land and sea surrounding Cuba. Finally, on October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane captured photographic evidence of missile bases under construction. On October 16, 1962, Kennedy assembled his team of advisors. The Cuban Missile Crisis had begun.
Fidel Castro joined the Soviet bloc. And this is really was the cause of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And when Castro, after Bay of Pigs, declared officially that he joined the Soviet bloc,
Put everything in very different position.
and through this, the Cuba became to the Soviet Union the same as the West Berlin to the United States. Useless small piece of land, very deep inside hostile territory.
But if you will not protect it, you will lose your face, and your other allies will not trust you.
Realizing the seriousness of the situation, President Kennedy quickly assembled a small team of advisors to analyze options and likely outcomes. The 12-man team was formerly known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, more commonly known as EXCOM. EXCOM consisted of Kennedy's closest advisors, including his brother Robert, as well as Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. While EXCOM pushed for a full invasion of Cuba, Kennedy was skeptical. He knew that the Russians would respond to an attack, which would most likely escalate to a nuclear response. On October 20th, after 5 hours of debate, Kennedy rejected the most aggressive choices with the committee, agreeing to take the least confrontational action by establishing a naval blockade while pursuing diplomatic options.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
With the world waiting anxiously, Kennedy quickly pursued a strategy of personal communication with Khrushchev, a strategy that had been in place well before the crisis started, as Khrushchev and Kennedy routinely exchanged informal, personal letters. Over Kennedy's time in office, the two would exchange a total of 120 letters. Throughout their 10 letters of communication over the course of 7 days, the two leaders developed a negotiation that would end this debate. After multiple exchanges debating each country's right to act in their own self-interest, a fourth letter features an angry Khrushchev and is the most threatening of the interactions. The Soviet leader accuses Kennedy of establishing an ultimatum and employing intimidation. Khrushchev rejects the naval quarantine and confirms his willingness to use nuclear weapons in response to pirate acts by the U.S. In what might have been the diplomatic turning point, Kennedy chooses not to respond to Khrushchev's threats with more threats of his own, and appeals to his logical side by recounting the Soviets' past assurances on Cuba. Khrushchev responds with a lengthy, rambling letter that proposes a resolution. If the U.S. promises not to invade Cuba, the Soviet Union will dismantle their weaponry in Cuba. Before Kennedy can respond, Khrushchev provides another letter that offers a different solution. Now the Russians also propose the removal of all NATO missiles in Turkey. Using the delay in communication and translation to his advantage, President Kennedy agrees to Khrushchev's first offer and confirms his promise to not invade Cuba. At the same time, he secretly sends his brother Robert to meet with a Russian diplomat to discuss the offer. The meeting was critical to the diplomatic resolution, with the two agreeing that the missiles in Turkey would be removed 6 months after the removal of the Cuban missiles, but could not be announced by either side publicly. On October 28th, Khrushchev and Kennedy exchanged their final letters, and the crisis was resolved.
So I think that their two leaders, with all these problems, cultural, linguistic and others, were very successful negotiators. And it is very important for the future. It is very important that you have to be balanced when you negotiate.
While the letters effectively solved the crisis, more importantly, they are proof of the essential acts of diplomacy that took place. They offer generations of view into the complicated and open discussions these two great leaders shared, as well as the respect they had for their use of words, which they chose wisely. The end result of the crisis was not only remarkable for the compromise, but also the changes it inspired, including a ban on nuclear weapon testing. Kennedy and Khrushchev understood each other's needs and were able to negotiate a compromise. The understanding was made on a relationship built on words. And like most relationships, words that express joy, frustration, and unfortunately, sadness.